are happy to start the discussion today, which I mentioned first that it will be filmed, but it's only us who will be, and we will stop it when we open for discussion, so that no one would feel intimidated by that. I'm Olivia, and we have Daria and Sandra with us today to discuss the topics of borders, social reproduction. Maybe we get to say something about extraction. Let's see where we get. But I think these are topics that connect our interests in various ways. And today we have already heard a lecture by Sandro at the university, and we have been discussing some rather or more on an abstract level, theoretical level on multipolarity, power, and capital. But I think in this discussion we will try to start from the ground, and let's see where it takes us. So, do you want to start, Daria, by saying some initial points?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Daria Krivonos. First of all, thank you, Olivia, for organizing this space, and thank you, Sandro, for today. That was a really generous day. We had a full day starting at 10, and now it's the third part of the day, and it was a really stimulating and exciting topic and discussion. And I think I would like to start my commentary with some reflections on the horizons of our political imagination now, and the reinvention of internationalism, and the point with which Sandro ended his talk. And so I would like to pick from there and think from the current moment of the war in Ukraine and the war on Gaza. So like this point about internationalism, and like in a way you would expect that now when we see multiple forms of imperialism. Hello. Today when we see multiple forms of imperialism unfolding in front of our eyes, you would expect maybe that would prompt us to think like in more intersectional ways and to think about multiple forms of imperialism operating. But I think that what we see instead is the acceleration and the normalization of civilizational narratives, anxieties, especially I think in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine. And of course, maybe it's like particularly felt in this part of Europe, in Finland, because like historically Finland has been also kind of characterized and by civilizational anxieties because of the proximity to Russia, and had like precarious relations with whiteness. So there was this constant kind of need to prove its belonging to a Western hemisphere, to prove that we're not Russia and we are white. But now apparently Alex Stubb said that finally Finland is fully part of the West, because Finland joined NATO. So it also shows that even membership in the EU was not enough to kind of calm this civilizational anxiety, but something more is always needed to kind of continue. But I think that also this civilizational anxiety is structured around these very rigid boundaries and binaries like democracy and autocracy, which at times look very stable and essential and static, but at times I think they become very blurry and they become really transgressed. And I think that what is really dangerous and scary to me is that how these essentialist binaries are mobilized very quickly and easily on political level to justify many decisions, and there is very little space for contestation because these binaries just feel so essential, and they kind of have always been there, and now we have to choose our side. Where do we belong? Is it the rest and the West? Are you the rest or the West? And I think that one of the most vivid examples of this is the closure of the Russian-Finnish border. And probably you all know the whole discussion that Russia and Belarus are, like this discussion is structured around the narrative that Russia and Belarus are instrumentalizing migration. So now there is this whole talk about instrumentalization of migration as though it started with authoritarian regimes. And this instrumentalization of migration becomes a tool of hybrid warfare. Also, like this language of hybrid warfare has become like really normalized. And I think it's quite interesting how it moved from the military language, so it's a really military term, and how it's being used like so easily and so essentially in the discussion of asylum and migration and in the society at large. Of course, we know that EU has a long history of securitization, but I think that with what hybrid warfare and what kind of is special for this particular moment is that there is this kind of merging of anti-Russian sentiment and this civilizational anxiety again, driven by the war in Ukraine and long-term anti-refugee, anti-black and anti-Muslim forms of racism. And they become part of the political mainstream. So I think that there is this really tight knot between anti-Russian attitude and anti-refugee racism, and it becomes like really, really difficult in public discussions and also in my teaching. I feel that when you come to the classroom, and it is quite often like, or it's already there, like it feels like hybrid warfare has always been like the language and this imaginary of hybrid warfare has always been with us. But yes, of course, it's a very recent story. And the other thing is that we see also how quickly even this binary of democracy versus autocracy is then quickly mobilized, paradoxically, to give up on many obligations to the international law and the Geneva Convention. And here I don't want to kind of romanticize the international law and Geneva Convention, because we know, of course, that also historically the international law was used as a colonial tool, and the Geneva Convention was also invented only to initially protect white European refugees. So I don't want to kind of romanticize that. But even with all these kind of problematic histories, like how quickly Finland and other EU states are ready to give up on their kind of international obligations, even though it is putting itself in opposition to autocratic regimes which violate human rights. And I also remember how everybody was laughing at Trump's wall, at the beautiful wall, but now Finland is building its own wall. So what was really ridiculed as Trump exceptionalism, as something that is like really stupid and would never happen in this part of the world, is actually becoming totally normalized and becomes very difficult to contest that. And also in addition to that, what was previously seen as traits of kind of barbaric, backward, post-communist societies like Poland that expel asylum seekers, again, is becoming something normalized in Finland. And then while the language is of security, why it's so difficult to contest that is that the language of security just becomes like the end of everything. Whenever you want to start the discussion, security says like, we are doing it in the name of security. But also the question is whose security? And I think that people and workers really don't have control over the conditions and meanings of this security. And actually we see that this imaginary sense of security for the nation state translates to the sense of, and not only the sense, but actually material consequences of social insecurity for workers in this country and beyond. Yes, and then kind of coming back to the question of internationalism, I see also the kind of proliferation of ideological camps that you are kind of prompted to choose only one form of imperialism against which you are kind of positioning yourself. So I think it's really kind of very difficult to think in relation to multiple forms of imperialism operating at the same time. And I've been doing work on kind of critical perspectives of Europeanization in Eastern Europe and in post-socialism. And I also see how in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine, decolonial theory has kind of gained its momentum in post-socialist region. And of course, I completely agree that it's very important to historicize and problematize Russian imperialism, the history and the present of Russian imperialism, and a lot of important work was done on Russian imperialism also before the full-scale invasion. But I think it's also interesting how decolonization in post-socialist region is often articulated as the re-establishment of your Europeanness and whiteness. So the whole idea of decolonization is about moving and decolonizing yourself from the Soviet past and kind of joining the Western modernity and kind of embracing Europeanness. And we discussed the question of Albania and kind of how Italy, actually a couple of days ago, Italy for the first time sent the boat with asylum seekers to Albania. Now Italy is outsourcing its asylum seeking obligations to Albania and building asylum reception centers. But it's interesting how the Prime Minister of Albania would say that we are doing it because we are European. So kind of for many countries in Eastern Europe, in the post-socialist region, proving your own Europeanness is also about jumping into this whole industry of expelling asylum seekers and actively participating in racism, bordering, and forms of expulsion. And we see that also this discourse of Europeanization and whiteness also in the case of Ukraine, where Ukraine is not only defending its own independence and right to exist, but beyond that, it's defending European civilization. And just, I think, a couple of days ago, the general and top commander of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, said that also that Ukrainian women can soon be mobilized to be sent to the war if it is required for saving Europe. So we see that also kind of how the language of Europe is playing in this in the war in Ukraine, and this is often kind of sold under the banner of decolonization. So this is what I would like to problematize here, and I think that this is what is so kind of divisive in this moment and problematic for building these internationalist solidarities. And of course, like this idea of saving Europe, of course, when we look at Europe from the perspective of Gaza, maybe there is really nothing that that should be saved in Europe. Yes. And then my final point and reflection is about crisis narratives, and which brings me to a question of social reproduction. Well, we also see the kind of proliferation of the language of crisis, that crisis is kind of the new newspeak, and apparently we live in the era of polycrisis. And I think that it's important also to rethink like the presentism of crisis narratives, and to think how for racialized minorities and for minoritized communities, crisis has been like really long in the making, and maybe actually crisis just arrived to the kind of core of white society, white majority, well, working class populations, while racialized communities have been always living in this crisis ordinary. I'm very inspired by feminist discussion of the ordinariness of crisis. And I've been doing work among Ukrainian migrants and refugees in Poland, and there I could also see, like, since I've been going there since 2020, and you can see that there was this indeed I would say, the kind of spectacle of solidarity in the first month of the war with Ukraine, like full-scale invasion. But now, with time, with the solidarity fatigue, you can see kind of how the obligations and the labor of social reproduction is being completely outsourced to these very Ukrainian refugee and migrant communities. And you can say that, and we still kind of have this narrative of standing with Ukraine. But then the question is, like, who is standing with Ukraine? And if we think that, okay, this is a very privileged, in a way, group who got this immediate access to temporary protection, and there was this, like, manifestations of solidarity, but then even in this case you can see that the EU doesn't have the infrastructure, and because it was designed in a way not to accept people. So also now even those who were initially welcomed became like in a way abandoned and expected to just join precarious and racist labor markets. Yeah, and just to give one example from my fieldwork, I've been doing fieldwork in some community centers and centers of help, and there you can see kind of how in the evening Ukrainian refugee and migrant women come to help other Ukrainian women, and they do that after a day of work as cleaners, as teachers, as domestic workers. So there is this, like now, the double shift or triple shift of doing this labor of social reproduction, and kind of how this labor is now outsourced to these very migrant communities, which is, of course, is not a surprise, because, as we know, there is the crisis of social reproduction, and it's the labor that has been done always for feminized and racialized communities. Yeah, I think I'll stop here and give the floor to Olivia.
Yeah, thanks. You raised so many questions or topics, and I'm thinking first of all that when you say like standing with Ukraine, then we can think of what it actually means. Also, if we complicate or try to see the different political forces that are involved in all of the discourse discourse and material practices of standing with Ukraine and supporting Ukraine, that what are we actually defending? And you also raised the question of social reproduction in this aspect, and I would like to jump back to the border between Finland and Russia that has been now closed for at least 10 months. And then there was also in the summer, there was the pushback law introduced, which hasn't been used, but it can be used with the main objective of stopping migrants from coming from Russia. And I was reading about this. So what happens then when you stop people from applying for asylum or crossing the border, and the people's these authorities said that okay, at some point if they're stuck on the border, maybe they have to be given food and water, and this is like very kind of necropolitical, that you leave people until they become so sick that there is an exception that you need to make into this pushback law. So you kind of like produce this sick bodies, and which also raises question of social reproduction. But this, I would like also to hear Sandra's ideas of what, when you raise the question of Europeanization, and there has been new reinforcements of the discourse of Finnish sovereignty, and you said like becoming part of NATO has been considered as being really part of the West, but how can we problematize this image of with reference, for example, to multipolarity, as Sandro has been discussing? What does it mean? and also we can take in here the new developments of creating these deportation centers, for example, that Italy has done in Albania, that Finland now also wants to do or place with the idea of doing these outsourced deportation centers. So would you like, Sandro, to say something about your views on this, what happened? You were mentioning the jurisdiction response to the Albania-Italy case, and also more largely your view on, can we discuss these issues from the perspective or using the language of multipolarity here?
Well, first of all, thank you for organizing this event. Thank you for coming. I'm happy to have the opportunity to share some ideas with you on the topics that have been already raised, addressed by Daria and Olivia. Indeed, I am convinced that we are living through a conjuncture of war, and that we have to take into account the possibility that this conjuncture will be a prolonged one. I speak of a conjuncture of war referring not only to the current wars that are fought on battlefields, but also to the proliferation of war regimes in countries that, like Finland and Italy, are not directly involved in wars. I think that the notion of war regime provides an effective angle on the topics we are discussing tonight, and in particular on migration and on social reproduction. Social reproduction in a conjuncture of war is by definition kind of strained, and there is a push to normalize social reproduction, to synchronize it with the needs of a war regime. This implies, for instance, an attack on, let's say, non-heteronormative ways of life and ways of reproducing life. Of course, this attack has different degrees of intensity. If you look at Gaza, if you look at Palestine, it is clear that the basic infrastructures that allow the reproduction of life are under attack, have been largely destroyed by the genocidal attack of the Israeli army. There is nothing comparable to that in Italy or in Finland, but nonetheless, what many feminists call the politicization of social reproduction is under attack. You know, the fact that social reproduction has been an important field of political experimentation, of development, of practices that foreshadow a different life. This is under attack in a very clear way. migration is kind of strictly connected with social reproduction, you know. Migration and borders. Borders are, among other things, also crucial devices that enable and organize regimes of social reproduction. And you know, in a conjuncture of war, there is again a kind of powerful push toward kind of disciplining and normalization of migratory movements. This takes many forms, you know. The militarization of border regimes is of course not new. But nowadays we are confronted with a kind of intensification of this militarization in many parts of Europe. On the other hand, if we look at the new pact on migration and asylum that was adopted by the European Parliament before the summer, then it is clear that the asylum regime as we knew it is under erasure. And what is happening these days around Albania is a clear manifestation of that. There are frictions. This is not a smooth kind of process. There are activists that organize against these forms, these radical forms of externalization of border and migration control. There was a demonstration in Albania yesterday that was quite important. And there are courts, there are judges that may take kind of oppositional views. This is what happened today. A court in Rome declared illegal the deportation of 16 migrants to Albania. The deportation happened over the last couple of years. So there are frictions, and we have, you know, to play within and against a field that is also characterized by frictions. But then there are also other implications of the regime of war for migration. I think we should pay attention to multifarious attempts in Europe and also beyond Europe to reorganize the geography of migration in a way that is compatible with the regime of war. Let me conclude this first intervention going back to the new pact on migration and asylum. This is the official title. You know. But if you read the text of the pact, it is quite impressive that you don't find many references to migration. The pact is basically on asylum. So you have to ask yourself why this happens. You know. Of course, the text re-establishes a firm distinction between refugees and so-called economic migrants. But economic migrants are out of the picture, you know. And in a way they are, because, you know, recruitment of migrant workers has definitively become in Europe a business of member states of the Union. in the 90s, in the first decade of this century, there were efforts of the European Commission, of the European Union, to kind of orchestrate the recruitment policies of the different member states. Now it is not anymore the case. And while the official rhetoric, not only of the far right, is an anti-migration rhetoric, if you look at what happens on the ground in Europe, well, they are recruiting tens of thousands of migrants every day. I was kind of surprised to read some months ago that Orban's Hungary recruited 500,000 Asian workers in the last 5 years to work in factories. That's kind of weird, because we know the rhetoric, we are familiar with the rhetoric of Orban. But I think we have to think through this kind of tension and contradiction. And then if you look at the way in which these workers are recruited, not only in Hungary, well, you see the rhetoric of human capital. Migrants are selected according to their presumed skills. You are confronted with many temporary recruitment schemes. There is a proliferation, of different schemes that in a way explodes the very unity of the figure of the migrant worker. But I think this is an important point. As activists, we are often very much focused, on the militarization of the border, on the war on migrants. These are, of course, real facts. We know it even too well. But there is another side. There is another side that we have to take into consideration also in order to understand the violence of the border, also in order to forge tools that allow us to struggle in a more effective way against the violence of the border regime.
Thank you. Do you should I go or do you? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I think that really brings up also the sort of things that you don't emphasize when you emphasize only the anti-migration rhetoric. You sort of forget questions, for example, that were very visible during the COVID pandemic, that there are these so-called essential workers, that all of our like food and systems of social reproduction are basically based on migrant labor. And yeah, I think it's sort of interesting to think what the role of social reproduction today is. Also connecting this to the like multiple or crisscrossing ideas of that, okay, we need to have some migrant workers, usually with specific skills, for example, caring skills that that are constructed to fit certain bodies that you don't want to import, for example, to Finland to do different kinds of care work. But then you have the other rhetoric of that connects to reproduction, not only like social reproduction in a broad sense, but biological reproduction that we have heard during the couple of weeks in Finland, that there aren't enough children born, and that young women, or it wasn't very much specified, that there was an idea of giving 10,000 to 30,000 euros for people under 30 who get children, to sort of, which implies reproduction of a sort of white Finland, because we could as well think that this so-called problem could be fixed by, instead of giving this 10,000 euros to some Finnish citizens, maybe you can just give it to some people who want to move here, as if there wouldn't be this problem of what kind of reproduction are we looking for.
No, I agree. It's a completely biopolitical project that it's like explicitly like what kind of babies do you want to have, what kind of citizens you want to have. It's only explicitly like white citizens, and then expelling and deporting or other non-white people. Yes, but also in relation to COVID pandemic, I think it was very interesting that, or very illustrative that in the first month of the pandemic, the borders were exceptionally open only for essential workers. So you'd expect like now in this situation partially, like the borders are closed for some migrants, but during the pandemic, the borders were open only. Like there were very few exceptions for who could travel and take flights, and then these essential workers, including migrant workers from Ukraine doing agricultural labor, the borders were open for them. Yes, and kind of what Sandro said about Hungary, I was also thinking about Poland that has been giving like 500,000 work visas to Ukrainian workers. It's actually the country which has been giving the highest number of residence permits and visas based on work. And then also, if you look more closely, is that since 2014, with the war in East Ukraine, most of these people came to Poland and the EU, but mainly to Poland as migrant workers. They didn't come as refugees, even though they were fleeing wars, but they were absorbed as migrant labor. And then Poland would, or the Polish authorities would say that we already are hosting so many Ukrainian refugees. That's why we are not obliged to open the borders for other non-European, non-white asylum seekers. But then actually what we see is that, yes, these people were absorbed as migrant labor. And this is in a way what is happening now, that Ukrainian refugees, even with a temporary protection, are obliged, of course, to survive as precarious workers in racist labor markets.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting how the question of survival and to be able to live, to have a life, is sort of, I think, in the center of what's happening in relation to war, but also migration in its temporary forms, also because it is these temporary schemes are often very much tied to having to economically sustain your life, which implies a need to reproduce your life in very precarious ways, things that we also see or that I see in my research with migrant workers who do platform gigs, that the question of actually being able to both reproduce your residence permit and reproduce your life is very much intertwined with the sort of productive work, or the work that actually results in getting some kind of income. So I think it points to the very fragility of social reproduction, but at the same time its very centrality in today's capitalism. So maybe we could continue from there.
Yes, I think the pandemic in Europe is too quickly forgotten. I mean, during the pandemic, there was a kind of explosion of debates. Many papers were written. We were surrounded by thousands of virologists, you know. Then it was forgotten. I was kind of struck last month. I spent a couple of weeks in Brazil, and practically in every discussion, particularly with activists, the first topic was the pandemic. And precisely the pandemic with respect to questions of social reproduction. I think this figure of the essential worker is an interesting figure. In my work with Brett Nilsson, we did a bit of research on the definition of essential workers in different parts of the world. We started from the US, where there was a very strict definition that has a military genealogy. But then we looked at some European countries, and above all at Argentina, at India, at Mozambique. I mean, crossing the north-south divide. And what is striking, maybe it is not surprising, but it is striking, is the fact that most figures of labor included in the definition of essential workers in different parts of the world are connected to circulation of commodities in particular, and to social reproduction. If I think back of the situation in Italy in 2020, 2021, I mean, it was kind of amazing because both circulation and social reproduction were kind of predicated upon the labor of people whose social reproduction regime borders the issue of survival. Just two examples of essential workers in Italy: the riders, so food delivery platforms. You know, before the pandemic in Bologna, the composition of the riders was quite mixed, but I would say that the prevailing figure was the student. Then there were migrants. I mean, in the first week after the outbreak of the pandemic, it completely changed. There were only migrants, only migrants. And then agricultural workers were also deemed essential workers, of course. But in general, for many years now, there is a majority of migrants working in the fields. But during the pandemic, there were only migrants. So you had this kind of strange situation in which the social reproduction writ large, the social reproduction of the Italian society depended on the labor of figures whose social reproduction regime, I mean, was a survival regime, tested not only by the pandemic, but also by the proliferation of borders during the pandemic. So I think it is important not to forget the kind of experience of the pandemic.
Can I comment? Yeah, actually, I also wanted to say something about how COVID was quickly forgotten. I think it again like relates to the point that of the presentism of crisis, that there is only like one crisis happening at the same time, and we can focus only on one thing going on. And then COVID kind of quickly disappeared. But I think that what also COVID showed, and I really remember that discussion, is that life will never be the same, because now we realized who does all this essential work. Now we're going to give claps to nurses every single day. And what else was there? Kind of this realization of, of the people, or of the labor of the people who do all this essential work. And then I think, but yes, indeed, it was quickly forgotten, and kind of all this like political discussion quickly vanished. But I think it wasn't even so political. It kind of stayed on the level of like kind of claps, but it was not so many demands, at least in Finland, I think, maybe were made on the level of actually promoting the rights of these workers, or like increasing the salaries, etc. But also the point about the kind of lessons that were quickly forgotten by COVID, I think it's also this disposability to premature death, and kind of how, again, migrant and racialized communities were first and foremost affected by the pandemic. And I still remember the discussion about like why Finnish Somalian community was more affected by COVID. And then there was the discussion that this is because these people don't speak Finnish, or they're not exposed to information, they just don't know that the pandemic is happening. But again, like the question of labor, the question of, okay, that these are workers who are exposed and through particular forms of work, through like contact work, through service work, so that these workers cannot stay home, that their work requires actually leaving homes. It was really kind of not really taken into account, which also I think shows us the kind of understanding of, okay, who does the work and what does it mean to be a worker. Continuing with the social reproduction regimes, and kind of how the social reproduction regimes of these essential workers are also being depleted. I was also talking to some Ukrainian agricultural workers who came to Finland during the pandemic, and then the discussion was like in the Finnish media that, okay, we suddenly realized that also Finnish strawberries don't grow on their own, that somebody actually has to do this work and then go and pick the strawberries. And in the morning we also had the discussion about Finnish blueberries, and this imagination of berries as something national, something that is very our own. But then the question again, like who picks this strawberries and blueberries, etc. And then so when I talk to Ukrainian workers, they would say that while coming to Finland to produce food for Finnish people, they themselves would need to bring food from Ukraine, because they wouldn't be able to afford food here in Finland. So again, like the question of social reproduction, that while reproducing the lives of Finnish people here, these workers themselves, like the spaces for social reproduction and their reproduction regimes are being under attack. Yeah, so, but I think in general that COVID-19 was a very important moment for the revival of interest in social reproduction, because I think that it just laid so bare in front of our eyes that actually the life is not being reproduced on its own, but importantly, it's the question of labor, which then makes some of us premature to death even.
Yeah, I think like just like you, that these questions of survival and social reproduction have always been there, but then the pandemic just kind of laid it before our eyes. But I'm still wondering, maybe on a more theoretical level, that do you have some, because I think these questions of social reproduction are both circulating in activist discussions, but also in more theoretical discussions much more than before, and perhaps it has also to do with the diversification or heterogeneity of forms of work that has always been there, but somehow maybe in Finland or in the rest of Europe has become much more visible, that there aren't, that wage work isn't as prevalent as before, and other forms of work become sort of a central part of capital today. But do you have some views on why social reproduction, also from a theoretical point of view, has gained so much attention, or why it's so central?
I mean, for several reasons. One has to do with labor, and both of you mentioned that. If you take social reproduction writ large, as a kind of lens through which to analyze labor, it is clear that what I like to call the multiplication of labor is kind of prevailing today. Moreover, nowadays I think we are confronted with kind of blurring of the boundary between production and social reproduction. What I was saying before about the COVID-19 pandemic is a good instance of that. Think of agricultural labor in many parts of Europe. Let's stay in Europe for a while. In southern Italy, in Finland. If you look at the way in which agricultural migrant labor is organized, you see that the regime of social reproduction is an integral component of that organization of labor. This points to a kind of blurring of the distinction between production and social reproduction. A blurring. I'm not saying that the distinction disappears. So this makes social reproduction kind of really interesting topic, and explains also the reason why there is such an interest in social reproduction. Then there is, let's say, at least a second reason that I already mentioned before. And this reason is the fact that feminist struggles and mobilization, feminist thinking, have politicized social reproduction, providing a kind of interesting viewpoint, once again, not only on social reproductive activity, but on society, on social relations. How do social relations appear if we consider them from the point of view of their reproduction? That's a question, I mean, to put it very quickly and simply, that has been asked by feminist thinkers and movements in many parts of the world over the last 50 years. So politicization of social reproduction also means kind of producing a contradiction between social reproduction and capitalism. or if you want to put it in more technical terms, between social reproduction and the reproduction of capital. You know. There are feminist thinkers that maintain that this contradiction is kind of constitutive of capitalism. We just mentioned the name of Nancy Fraser, you know. But you know, if you look, for instance, at Latin America, there are many feminist thinkers and activists that speak of a war between social reproduction and the reproduction of capital. And nowadays they speak of a war on social reproduction. Thinking, for instance, of the policies of the government of Javier Milei in Argentina, where feminist struggles have been particularly strong, powerful over the last 10 years. So it's quite clear that there is a huge interest in social reproduction. You know, a lot is at stake in social reproduction.
Yeah, I see that there is some questions. So, do you want to still raise some points that we haven't discussed, or should we finish with the stream and go to open for discussion?
Yeah, maybe I could just offer like also a quick comment. I think that I think it's always like so difficult to say like why certain theories and frames for thinking become so so popular at some moment. But I don't know, because at least being in this part of Europe, and I think in recent years there have been like many books published, like in the US context, in British context, and at least like in West European context. And I think that probably it also has to do in many ways with the proliferation of austerity and the realization that now more and more non-waged forms of labor are required to reproduce lives, and probably workers that were previously protected by the welfare state are now kind of more exposed to the to more kind of wilder forms of capitalism. But even like not taking such a long distance from Western Europe, like from the perspective of Eastern Europe, actually like austerity has been something going on for sure since the 90s. And then actually migration became a displaced model of social reproduction, that in order to reproduce a life, you have to migrate. So in a way also maybe try to be cautious, like where and why certain theories become so popular, and like why does it tell us about the moment in which we're living, and like who becomes affected by austerity and crisis at this moment, and who has been already for a very long time living under these conditions. Yes.
Thank you. So I think we now open for questions.
Yes, there is the question of internationalism that Daria was addressing at the beginning of her first intervention. I mean, we live in a conjuncture of war. I think that a better life on this planet is predicated upon our ability to struggle against the war, and this struggle can only be an internationalist struggle. This is just to keep this issue for the discussion.